Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Tonight, we bring you a special edition of our Federal Crime Report, examining some of the most significant federal prosecutions, indictments, guilty pleas, sentencing, and law enforcement action announced during the first week of June of 2026. From child exploitation investigation and fentanyl trafficking networks to public corruption, identity theft, organized crime, and major fraud schemes, federal authorities across the Northeast continue to pursue some of the region's most serious criminal offenders. Tonight's report spans from Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. We begin with one of the federal government's highest enforcement priorities, crime against children. Federal prosecutors announced numerous child exploitation cases this week, resulting in indictments, guilty pleas, and lengthy prison sentences across multiple states. In Maine, 45-year-old Godi G. Morgaza pled guilty to receiving and possession of child sexual abuse material. Federal investigators discovered hundreds of images and videos on cellular telephone. Prosecutors say he used to solicit illegal material online while residing in a halfway house. Authorities noted Morgaza had previously served more than 11 years in federal prison following an earlier child pornography conviction. Also in Maine, Jeffrey Furlong has received 30 months in prison after investigators linked child sexual abuse material to his online messaging account. Authorities said evidence recovered during the investigation included explicit material and communication expressing sexual interest in children. In New Hampshire, federal grand juries reunited indictments against Dover resident Sirius McGauley and Manchester resident Michael McBride. Prosecutors allege McGauley persuaded minors online to create and send sexually explicit material, while McBride allegedly received and possessed child sexual abuse materials while also failing to comply with federal sex offender registration requirements. Rhode Island prosecutors announced one of the most severe sentences this week. Jeremy Durango of Warwick received 140 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to producing and possessing child sexual abuse material. Investigators recovered hundreds of illegal images and videos and determined Durango had produced materials involving sexual abuse of a minor child. Massachusetts authorities arrested Javier Abrato Perez Infanto of Dorchester on federal charges allegedly receipt of child sexual abuse material. Prosecutors stated investigators discovered numerous videos depicting the abuse of a very young child. Federal prosecutors in Massachusetts also secured a guilty plea from Joshua Rogers of Chicago, who admitted to sexually exploiting a 14-year-old Massachusetts girl throughout online communication and coercion. In Pennsylvania, former Topeka police officer Christopher Cordes received a sentence of 330 months in prison after being convicted on coercion and enticement of a minor, production of child pornography, possession of child pornography, and additional disturbing offenses uncovered during the investigation. Pennsylvania prosecutors also announced the indictment of Christopher Jones of Narcock of charges allegedly sexually exploiting of a minor and the production of child sexual abuse material. Federal authorities continue to emphasize that online child exploitation investigations remain among the Department of Justice's highest priorities nationwide. The fentanyl epidemic and large-scale narcotic trafficking operation remain major drivers of federal prosecutions across the Northeast. In Maine, Alan DeBoss was sentenced to more than 10 years in prison for participating in a conspiracy involving fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and crack cocaine distribution throughout the Penobscot County. Federal prosecutors in Connecticut announced that Lester Arlington pled guilty after authorities discovered approximately 21 kilograms of cocaine hidden in a sophisticated concealed compartment inside a vehicle stopped by Connecticut State Police. Another Connecticut defendant, Eric Rottenty, was sentenced for his role in a southwestern Connecticut drug trafficking organization connecting to distribution of fentanyl and crack cocaine. Investigators noted that some seizure narcotic contained nizazine and xylazine, substances increasingly associated with fentanyl overdoses. Massachusetts prosecutors secured a major sentence against Benjamin Hunt of Falls River. Hunt received 23 years in prison after admitting to operating an online drug trafficking marketplace throughout the Telegram application and distributing narcotics that resulted in an overdose death of a 17-year-old victim. Federal investigators stated Hunt sold fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, ketamine, LSD, counterfeit pills, machine gun conversion devices, and privately manufactured firearms while accepting payments through the cryptocurrency. In New York, federal prosecutors announced narcotic conspiracy charges against Rochester resident Quentin Yancey and Johnny Mays, allegedly their involvement in a heroin and fentanyl trafficking operation that operated for several years. Buffalo defendant Torrance Bailey was sentenced to more than 11 years in prison for participating in a large-scale cocaine and fentanyl trafficking conspiracy. Federal prosecutors in New Jersey announced major sentencing involving a Burlington County wiretap investigation that dismantled a drug trafficking and firearm network responsible for distributing fentanyl, crack cocaine, and powder cocaine while also trafficking firearms. The lead defendant, Mansfield Johnson, received a sentence of 225 months in federal prison. Federal authorities also announced the sentencing of Essex County drug trafficker leader who received 234 months in prison for his role in a fentanyl analog distribution and money laundering conspiracy. Meanwhile, one of the largest organized crime cases announced this week came from Massachusetts, where federal prosecutors unsealed a racketeering charge against 26 alleged members and associates of the Toronto's gang. According to prosecutors, the gang is linked to multiple murders, attempted murders, kidnapping, witness intimidation, extortion, large-scale trafficking of fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine throughout New England. Federal authorities describe the prosecution as a part of the ongoing effort to dismantle one of the region's most violent criminal organizations. Federal investigators also announced a major development involving fraud, public corruption, identity theft, and financial crimes. In Vermont, 7 individuals were charged in a conspiracy involving the U.S. Treasury checks and fraudulent identification documents. According to prosecutors, the scheme involved more than $500,000 in stolen Treasury checks that were deposited into frequently opened bank accounts throughout the New England area. Connecticut prosecutors announced that former Chief Financial Officer Pamela Aguilar pled guilty to wire fraud after allegedly embezzling more than $739,000 from a DeBari software company over several years. Federal prosecutors in Massachusetts secured the conviction and sentencing of former physician Dr. Panjak Murchia. Investigators determined Murchia submitted fraudulent insurance claims and concealed millions of dollars in income from tax authorities. He was sentenced to 58 months in prison in order to pay nearly $1.85 million in restitution. Another Massachusetts corporation case involved former Norfolk County Sheriff's Office official Thomas Brady, who pled guilty to offenses involving abuse of public authority and witness tampering. Federal prosecutors in New Jersey announced indictments against Hillsborough Township School District Business Administrator Aman Muhammad and co-conspirators in a kickback and overtime fraud scheme connecting to multi-million-dollar school construction project. According to prosecutors, Muhammad allegedly accepted approximately $70,000 in cash kickbacks in exchange for approving inflated overtime records. New Jersey federal authorities also announced the sentencing of former Newark Deputy Mayor Carmelo Garcia for participating in a bribery and kickback scheme involving Newark's development projects. Federal investigators also allege Garcia received cash payments, jewelry, and other benefits in exchange for using his official influence to advance redevelopment proposals. In Pennsylvania, William Knight received a sentence of 54 months in prison after participating in an identity theft scheme involving stolen personal information and fraudulent rental vehicle transaction. Federal immigration and firearm cases also generated significant developments during this week. In May, United Kingdom citizen Hamad Mohammed Nagy pled guilty after federal authorities alleged he illegally entered the United States through a remote section of the Canadian border and later provided false statements to investigators. In New Hampshire, federal authorities removed Taiwanese fugitive Ying Han Liu from the United States after authorities determined she had overstayed her lawful entry. Taiwanese officials alleged Liu was involved in drug trafficking, fraud, and embezzlement offenses. Federal prosecutors in Massachusetts announced a guilty plea of Luis Angel Rodriguez Calama, a Mexican national previously deported twice from the United States who admitted to possessing a firearm while unlawfully presenting in the country. New Jersey prosecutors charged Nicholas Scofield of Brooklyn after authorities alleged he threatened an immigration and customs enforcement officer and member of officer's family outside the ICE detention facility. Federal prosecutors in New Jersey also secured a guilty plea from a convicted felon, Qatar Whitehead, who admitted to using an assault rifle during an armed carjacking and later possessed narcotics and firearms connected to the investigation. Pennsylvania prosecutors announced charges against Gary Hardy for allegedly failing to comply with federal sex offender registration requirements after relocating from Pennsylvania to New York. Federal firearm prosecutors were also announced in New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, involving convicted felons allegedly possessing firearms or ammunition despite being federally prohibited. As we conclude tonight's federal crime report, several enforcement trends continue to emerge throughout the Northeast. Child exploitation investigations remain among the federal government's highest priority, with prosecutors securing lengthy prison sentences against offenders accused of targeting children online and producing illegal content. Fentanyl trafficking continues to domain narcotic enforcement efforts as federal agents target organizations responsible for distributing synthetic opioids that contain fueling overdose deaths across the country. Investigators also increasingly confront criminal organizations that utilize encrypted messaging platforms, cryptocurrency transactions, sophisticated identity theft schemes, and interstate distribution networks to facilitate criminal activity. Finally, public corruption, healthcare fraud, financial crimes, and organization gang violence remain significant priorities for federal law enforcement agencies operating throughout the region. Federal prosecutors across the Northeast have made clear that these investigations will continue as authorities pursue individuals accused of exploiting children, trafficking narcotics, defrauding taxpayers, and threatening public safety. For Englebrook Independent News, I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for joining us for the special federal crime report. Stay safe and good night.